So there we are after a half year's work of engine conversion and suspension upgrades. It's 6 days now until we leave for Lapland, so the pressure has been on and is still on. Henry is ready to go out of the garage. I still haven't done any testing kilometers. Engine is running though. And I thought I'll give you a quick look around of what I've been up to in the past half year. Of course, the main change is down here in the engine bay. The old 2-liter 4-cylinder petrol, the Volvo B20, left the building, and in there now houses a Land Rover 300 TDI engine. It was a hell of a job to make it fit, because it's quite a big lump compared to the original B20, but as you can see, it's in. The 300 TDI engine has been completely overhauled. Wasn't the original plan to overhaul it, but the crankshaft pulley ran loose, it cracked and it lost its pre-tension, and the crankshaft pulley started wearing in on the woodruff key, and in its turn the woodruff key started wearing in on the crank. So I had a slot in the crank that was twice as big as the woodruff key, which meant I could either do very expensive repair on it or swap out the crank, and in both of the cases the crank would have to come out of the engine. So I ordered a reconditioned one from the UK, swapped the crank in the engine. Well, then you're basically up to a full rebuild. Once you start swapping the crank, you might as well hone the cylinders and put new piston rings on. All the valve seals were gone, so the head had to be rebuilt. Basically full rebuild. All ancillaries, water pump, alternator, glow plugs, fuel pump, the whole shebang, it's all new. Main thing that catches the eye down here is the air intake. I didn't have any space left for the air filter housing, so that one runs here all the way to the passenger footwell, and here's the engine air filter box. Besides that, you'll see the piping on the right there for the intercooler. The intercooler sits in the spot where the original radiator sat, and there was unfortunately no space at all for a big turbo diesel radiator, so the radiator had to go up to the roof. Up here on the forward part of the roof is a one-off piece from Elisport. Elisport in the UK has fabricated this radio after some sketches of mine. They fine-tuned the design a bit and optimized it where they saw needed, and this is the result. It's an old style radiator with a built-in header tank, which drains into a little catch tank just for the overflow. You can see over here. And it's cooled by two spal fans. I believe these are 11.5 inch. They're 12 volts. We couldn't get them in 24 volts, so what I've just done is put them in series. It works. Little drawback is if one fails, the other one is out of order too. So looking a bit ahead in the future, I might want to change these for 24. So at least if one breaks, there's one left in operation. But this is how it will be for the first trip, and since we're going to Lapland in -20, -30, I don't expect too many cooling issues actually. And that means there's also a few extra liters of coolant. I had to pour 17 to 18 liters of coolant in before it was filled up, so to get that whole mass moving is a bit much for the original water pump, and that's why I installed a Davies Crack electric water pump. It's switched together with the fans on the roof by a thermostat switch in here. I've mounted two thermostat switches, one set to a slightly higher temperature and one set to a slightly colder temperature, just so I can switch a bit in between those two depending on the conditions we're driving in. Down here is where most of the work went into. What you see here is a Volvo FD51 transfer case. It's used on the Volvo C202, which is a slightly newer model of this one, and the Volvo C303 series, so the Volvo TGB. The FD51 is a pretty simple gearbox, small but strong. It's got selectable four-wheel drive, which is operated by vacuum, so it's permanently in four-wheel drive. If you give the transfer box a vacuum, then it will switch to two-wheel drive. The main reason to change this one was the 1:1 ratio high gear. The original Volvo gearbox has a 1.38:1 high gear. Basically the RPM would be way too high with a diesel engine. Even with a 2-liter petrol engine, which likes to rev, it's a pretty low geared car. And pretty is an understatement. I'm talking about with the standard driveline, even with the big tires, I was doing 3300 RPM at 80 kilometers an hour, which is not a relaxed way of driving. With this setup, she should be around, if I remember correctly, about 2000 RPM at the same speed. Next to the FD51 we have the Volvo M45 gearbox. The original gearbox here was a Volvo M40, which is already on the weak side for the original engine, and with 350 Newton meters of torque it would be blown to bits by the time I reach the end of the street here. So this one has made space for M45, still a 4-speed, and main reason for that is drivetrain length. I would have loved the 5-speed, but the distance between the transfer case and the rear axle is short, and so is the distance between the transfer case and the front axle. If I would have put in a 5-speed and pushed the whole driveline even further back, then I would have ended up with this silly, ridiculous short rear prop shaft, and I don't want to end up having to change my U-joints every 1000 kilometers. Besides that, it will cause vibrations, and double yoke drive shafts, I know they can fix the vibrations, but I'm not too keen on those. So stuck with a 4-speed, and the 4-speed, as you can see, is linked to Land Rover bell house. So Volvo gearbox, Land Rover bell house, and this is not just a Land Rover bell house. It's a special extra short version from Ashcroft Transmissions in the UK. It's an R380 short / stumpy bell house, and in between there is a custom made adapter plate to link the two together. The stumpy bell house sits on the engine from here on its original 300 TDI and forward, and what I have done is modify, I'll give you some extra light, modify the sump a bit to clear the front prop shaft. Also, as you can see, I made a nice little botch there. I've extended the front bump stops a bit with some wood. I'll make it a more permanent solution later on, but I first want to drive it a bit and see what the optimal length of those is. I think the bump stops might sit a bit too low at the moment. I hope I can make the wood a bit thinner and then settle on a permanent solution later on. Then over to the exhaust. The exhaust is made of Land Rover pieces. It's an original Defender 300 TDI downpipe, it's a Defender 90 mid-box, and it's a Defender 90 tailpipe, but all completely modified beyond recognition. Under the heat shrink here, or not the heat shrink, it's exhaust trap. Under the exhaust trap is quite a few incisions in the exhaust where I've adjusted it and welded it back up again. So downpipe, then we get the mid box or the silencer box. I've also got a straight through pipe, and it can be swapped in about 5 to 10 minutes. So it's got a flange here, bolted flange, and it's got a bolted flange on the back end. So depending whether I'm driving with my mates or the missus is coming along, I can go for straight through or a nice quiet car. I've given the exhaust original Valp twist, which means it's basically the same setup. Downpipe, the routing, the location of the mid box, and the exit of the tail. The fuel tank is still original. I have renewed all the piping. As you can see, there's copper piping going there and on that side. I had to add one because the original petrol engine only has a feed pipe, and the 300 Ti needs a feed and a return. So the feed pipe goes to the original point on the tank, and the return pipe actually goes to the filler point of the tank, and it pours into there. Just made a T-joint on that. Also, the speedometer doesn't match up anymore, because this combination of axles and transfer box is not supposed to be in this car and never has been standard. And there are no gear kits to change the speedometers. So what I've done is I've mounted a, I think it's called an inductive probe from video, and I mounted a little steel tap. It's hard to see from here, but I mounted a little steel tap on the handbrake. So the steel tap goes by the probe and it sends a pulse to the speedometer, and after I've calibrated the speedometer, this should give a pretty accurate speed. Here you can see some of the shifter mechanism. That's actually a bitch to make, because the shifter mechanism has to run on the left hand side of the engine, and it's basically a long stick that works its way all around the engine and operates the gearbox. So you can see a little ball joint over there. The blue hoses you see there, they go to a pneumatic cylinder. On the standard Valp, the gear shifter mechanism for the transfer box runs on the right hand side of the engine. But with the design of the 300 TDI engine, there was absolutely no space for that. So I had to solve this one a bit differently, and I've been wanting to do a pneumatic transfer box selector for years. I never had a good reason to do it because it costs quite a bit of money, and you know, I never thought it was worth a silly gimmick, but now I finally had a good reason to bring my plans into reality. Up there you can see the pneumatic cylinder that operates the transfer box. The hoses go to a 5-3 valve up there, an electronic 24 volt valve, which is controlled from the dashboard. And this one is fed by the little compressor for my lockers. I've also got a big compressor for tire inflation. You see the air tanks here. But I don't want to have to fill up these tanks every time I want to shift the transfer case between high and low. So I'm just feeding the air with a small locker compressor. Here you can also see the vacuum membrane to operate the 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive on the transfer box. And you can see the handbrake mechanism. Until here it's standard car, standard Volvo Valp, and from here on it's the TGB/C202 handbrake cable. Also here you can see some hoses. One set going forward for the front cap heater and one set going aft for the rear cap heater. And the oil and fuel circuit. This is the original 300 TDI diesel filter, including housing. Normally in a Defender it's mounted on the wing, on the inner wing of the car, but I've mounted it on the engine here. Oil filter house and oil filter housing is unchanged, but what I have done is add an oil cooler. The 300 TDI as standard has got an oil cooler integrated with the water radiator, but as my radiator has gone to the roof, that means there's no oil cooler either. So I have installed the universal oil cooler from Hurricane with some AN fittings. Let's go and have a look over there. Up there you can see the Hurricane oil cooler. I know it's a bit hard to see, but it's really cramped in this car with all the cabling and piping and all the gizmicks that come with a turbo diesel engine. It's a pretty big oil cooler, but in this case I thought better a bit too big than too small. There is a thermostat in the oil cooling circuit anyway. So even though this one might be a bit big, it won't be used anyway until it's needed, so there's no risk of overcooling the oil, so to say. In front of that oil cooler, well, on the video it might look in front, but in real life they are exactly offset, is the intercooler from Sport. It's Got a small frontal surface, but it's a big thick chunk. It's 115 millimeters thick if I remember correct. So it lets through quite a bit more air than the standard intercooler and also cools it down further. Both the intercooler and the oil cooler are cooled by spell fans, small ones. And here I've pulled the same trick as on the roof radiator. I couldn't get them in 24 volts, so I've put them both in series. It's two 12-volt ventilators in series. It's nice to have a car that goes a bit faster, but then it's also important that it can stop a bit faster. I haven't gone to disc brakes yet. It's something I would like to do in the future, but as you might know, in Norway modifications like that need to be approved, and therefore I left the drum brakes as is and I put in a brake booster. It's not a conventional one that goes onto the pedal, it's basically a standalone unit. So fluid from the master cylinder goes in, fluid goes from there to the drum brakes, but it's also fed by a vacuum, so it basically amplifies the fluid pressure. To cope with all the extra power, or not so much to cope with the power, but to cope with the higher cruising speed and the higher accelerations, I have mounted some different shocks. My original conies were pretty knackered, so it was time for a replacement anyway, and I found these on Finn.no, the Norwegian eBay, so to say. Brand new in the box, half price, so I thought I'll strike myself a good deal. It's not Fox or King, unfortunately, there was no room in the budget for that, but these are Asian copies of them. They're Pro Fender shocks, 2.5-inch smooth body with piggyback reservoirs, as you can see up there. They didn't fit on the car at all, of course, so I custom made some shock mounts, all made from scrap steel, which I got from a friend of mine, but it does the job. Top, and some beefy chunks on the axle for the bottom. I've never had any proper travel limiter straps, but now I put on new shocks, so I thought it was time to invest some on those. Bought these straps from QSP to limit the outward travel. Inward travel is limited by the bump stops, of course. And then I put some small elastic bands on just to stop them flying around and hitting the tires, so the elastic band just stretches out when the axle travels down. In here things are pretty much as they were before, or at least they look like they are pretty much as they were before. This is a new laser cut plate and it's filled with VDO single view dials. Expensive as shit, these dials, but this is a 24 volt car and I couldn't find any other 24 volt dials for what I wanted. It shows turbo pressure right top, it shows exhaust gas temperature left top, and then we have oil pressure left bottom, water temperature right bottom, and the speedo in the middle. Up here I have the original fuel meter, the fuel level meter. You might think, why the hell did he renew all the gauges and did he leave that crappy original fuel meter? Well, I'll tell you, the sensor in the tank works with a resistance range which isn't used anymore on modern dials, so I couldn't find any other dials that would work with the level gauge in the tank, with the level sensor. So for now I thought I'd stick with the original gauge, and later on I want to replace the tank anyway with a bit bigger capacity tank in aluminium, so then I can swap out the gauge too. Also I've gone from 4 lights on the dash to 8. This one is for the 4-wheel drive. If this is activated, it lights up. This one lights up when low gear is activated. High beam, glow plugs, left right indicator of course, and this is oil pressure and alternator. Then the switch box here is pretty much as it was, only I've added controls for the low gear. I have to show you this, it works pretty fancy. So ARB compressor on for the lockers, and then low gear, Also then the light on the dash lights up. And high gear. Low gear. High gear. Well, over here next to the high and low gear switch we have the 4-wheel drive switch, so 4-wheel drive on, 4-wheel drive off. And then we have rear locker. Up there is the switch for fans on, in case I want to override the thermostat switch, which is mounted in the cooling circuit. I'll show you. It's pretty noisy, these fans. I'm sure it will cool like hell. It better does, because it's noisy like hell. My girlfriend isn't gonna like it, but well, I really didn't have any other space for the radiator, so this is how it's gonna be. From the outside it's almost impossible to see that this car has undergone the engine conversion. So, to give a little hint, I bought the original Land Rover 300 TDI stickers. Normally they sit on a Defender on the front wing, the lower part just in front of the front door. And I have these on both sides and on the back, so little wink to the Land Rover. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do have any questions or comments, post them in the field below and I'm happy to answer them for you. Alright, cheers guys.